My name is Hector Saldana. I'm the music curator here at the Wittliff Collections. I'm also interim director here. I want to thank the staff for being here and good friends and Professor Lasser back there to give us his seal of approval, and JT and Mr. Scantz and all the friends here. This is an event that really had been bubbling in my mind, but really Peter Blackstock in the center, and Bob Livingston had brought it to my attention that we should kick off the year this way. My wife and I were out in the middle of West Texas near Alpine when Peter had the brainstorm that we should do this. Both men have excellent new books. So this event I'm excited about because one I've written about and have done programs with Bob Livingston and Gypsy Alibi, his memoir of his time taking part in some of the most legendary records ever made in Texas and performing side by side with and collaborating with Jerry Jeff Walker, Michael Martin Murphey, Ray Wiley Hubbard, Gary P. Nunn, and the list goes on and on. He's a solo artist and singer-songwriter in his own right. And then my dear friend Peter Blackstock, who's a great friend of the Wittliff Collections. One time we had an event here and one of the panelists couldn't make it. Peter was kind enough to jump up on stage and really kickstart the whole thing. He's a longtime music journalist. He was a senior music writer and a columnist for the Austin American-Statesman, co-founder of No Depression magazine, which is a great publication with regard to the ins and outs of Americana music and everything that we love about music that sometimes is hard to categorize. His book, different than Bob's, is called Old Number One at 50, A History of Guy Clark's First Album. Now, we don't just willy-nilly do events here at the Wittliff Collections, and sometimes even great ideas, we can't always get them going. But Peter's idea made a lot of sense because the Wittliff Collections, thanks to Bill Wittliff, one of his last gifts to us was Terry Allen's Crow, which contained Guy Clark's ashes. So we are the final resting place for one of the most revered writers of Texas music. And then we just closed down an exhibit called Viva Terlingua that featured Bob very prominently talking about the making of that historic record, that quintessential, really, Texas record. So that had an excellent 2.5-year run. So I think that confluence made it all make sense. And I always like the word new. So these are new books. I've read them cover to cover. I would highly recommend them. They are for sale. So without further ado, and I'll shut up, let's talk about music. So Peter, let's start talking about Guy Clark, because I want to kind of set the stage. Guy Clark, so integral, right, to the music you were making with Jerry Jeff, but yet a much different kind of performer. You know, I mean, I don't think when I think of Guy Clark, I don't think of an extrovert necessarily, you know, or wanting to be a very shiny, glittery star. So this record that had songs like LA Freeway, Desperados Waiting for a Train, The Train, depending on who's singing it, right? All the other ones. In Peter's book, we learned that record, first of all, didn't start out sounding the way it sounds, or even containing the songs that it ultimately did. Why was it so hard to make? Why do you think it was such a struggle to get that final record, how Guy wanted it?
Well, Guy was signed to RCA Records in 1974 by an executive named Mike Lipskin, who was also a producer, but he hadn't really produced a lot of new records. He had done a lot of reissues and doing engineering on reissues of stuff and had gained some renown for that. But he really wanted to produce songwriters too. And so when he signed Guy to RCA, he said the one specific thing that I want is if you sign with us, I'm going to produce the record. And Guy was fine with that. at least at first, because, I mean, I think he was like, okay, well, I need this record deal. I need to get on a big label and get my first record out. He was already in his early 30s by that point, because of Jerry Jeff covering LA Freeway and That Old Time Feeling on his self-titled record from 1972, and then he did Desperados on Viva Terlingua in '73. So the pump was already sort of getting primed for fans of this sort of growing cosmic country, outlaw country, whatever you want to call it. There was room for Guy to have a record out of his own, and so he agreed to this, and then he got into the studio with the guy and with, I shouldn't say the guy, the producer, and it didn't really come out the way that Guy wanted it to sound. He was pretty negative about it in comments he made to the press, like that it was just horrible. I had, thanks to Tamara Saviano, who wrote a major biography of Guy Clark about 10 years ago and then did a documentary film about Guy and Townes and Susanna. Thanks to Tamara, I was able to hear the unreleased version that Mike Lipskin recorded in 1974, and I write about that in the book, and I do some comparing between the two versions. I didn't think it was just a disaster like Guy seemed to think it was, but I do think the one that ultimately got released, produced by Neil Wilburn in 1975, I do think that was a stronger record. A lot of what got talked about at the time was how the Mike Lipskin version made Guy sound too slick and too produced, and I don't think it's really that pronounced how different it is, but I do think it's toned down a bit on the version that came out, and I think it was not so much that the record Lipskin made was bad, it was that it didn't really reflect who Guy wanted to sound like, and on his first record that was important. So I think he did the right thing by holding out and re-recording it. He basically went back to the demos he had made of these songs, and those had been recorded with this guy Neil Wilburn, and Neil produced the record from there. I think some of the demo stuff was actually on there, and then they added overdubs and stuff. Some of they just re-recorded altogether. But it was the bigger thing to me. The bigger thing than the sound was he changed some songs in between. It wasn't like he didn't like the songs that he had done with Mike Lipskin, because almost all of those that didn't end up on Old Number One ended up on the next record, Texas Cookin'. But I think he consciously elevated some of the better songs that he ever wrote that he had initially not earmarked for Old Number One, and thought, I should put these on here. And that included She Ain't Going Nowhere, which he, for a long time, referred to as his favorite of all his songs. And also Texas 1947, which, when Old Number One came out in the fall of 1975, Johnny Cash had a hit with that on the radio. So for that not to be on Guy's first record, it would have been really odd. So I think in some ways the success of the final record versus that first record was that partly the sound and the nature of the production, but even more songs that he swapped out that made Old Number One really a classic at this point.
So one of Bob Livingston's secret history is not so secret, but your own Nashville experience with Michael Martin Murphey putting together Geronimo's Cadillac, and in the way that it all happened. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe also how you were maybe introduced to that intersection with Guy's songs, or Guy Clark just as a songwriter? But I think there is overlap with this sort of maybe uncomfortable feeling with going into the Nashville scene, or not knowing exactly how they make the record. Talk about that, Bob.
My situation, I was playing with Michael Murphey, living in Los Angeles. I'd had a record deal, gone out to L.A. With Capitol Records, and I was, writing and trying to figure out what I was going to do. It was all a dream. to be able to, for any of this to happen. And I happened to meet Michael Murphey picking up a hitchhiker who told me, and he was an auto mechanic, and that night Murphy called me, who are you? Why am I calling you? And I had told him about meeting Ray Wiley Hubbard in Red River, and they had gone to high school with Murphy, so it was like all this synergistic stuff that had happened. And Murphy says, well, we need to meet. So I lived up in Wrightwood, California, when Michael was living up there. And one thing led to another, and at some point, we called ourselves the Melodious Mountain Music Brothers. And so, for some, we were on this hook of Melodious Mountain, and Murphy created this publishing company called the Mountain Music Farm. And one of the writers was Guy Clark. So it's the first time I met him. I don't exactly know if those demos, all made demos. I don't know if they were part of this, what you were talking about, but that happened. And later on, we go to Texas to do a little tour, and my record deal fell through. I didn't know what I was going to do. He said, I'll come play bass with me. I've got some gigs back in Texas. And I said, bass? I don't know how to play bass. And he said, you'll learn. And he handed me this Fender Precision, and I became a bass player for the next 40 years because of that. But we came to Texas. You never know who's going to be in your audience, do you? Never. And in our audience at the Rubaiyat, we were speaking about that earlier, in Dallas, Texas, was he was a producer from Nashville. He had produced Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash. His name was Bob Johnston. He did Nashville Skyline. And somehow or another, we sign up and do a little audition for him. He says, we need to make a record next Wednesday. I said, next Wednesday? Nashville, next Wednesday, Studio A, Columbia. And, I've got a George Jones session I'm going to reschedule. But I want to do you guys, it's Wednesday and Thursday. Can you make it? Can you make it? And he's looking straight at Murphy. He hadn't looked at me yet. I'm just like, and we had played a few songs for him in this little audition. And are you going to make it? Are you coming? I need to know. Are you going to come? And Michael, well, yeah, I'll come. And then he says, what about him? And Murphy said, what do you mean? He goes, what about him? Is he funky? And Murphy said, just look at him. What do you think? So he turned at me and he grabbed me by the shoulders and said, you come too. So we go to Nashville, and it was I didn't get, all of a sudden there's this world-class recording studio. I had never been in a studio. And I believe that Neil Wilburn might have been the engineer. Now, was Neil Wilburn Wilburn Brothers?
He did get into it through engineering, so it very well could have been. Yeah.
So he is the engineer. We do Geronimo's Cadillac, that album. And Neil Wilburn, when I played with, I wrote this song called It's a Good Night for Singing, and that came out on this record. And I believe that both of the Wilburn brothers are on the cover. We're in a bar, yeah.
You got to tell them, how many songs did you all cut in that 1 or 2 day session? You and Michael.
26 songs. I mean, the thing is, it was just a duo. I was playing bass with Murphy, and we had played all these shows, and he was a pretty stern taskmaster. Have to get it together, and bass is in the third, and then the next time through it goes to the 2 rather than the 3. I'm reeling, going, oh my God. So I'm making it up as I go along, and but we were tight as a drum. And when Bob Johnston heard us, he heard us do this song called Calico Silver, and it was just the first line No rain and the weather got warm. I broke down and sold my farm, headed for the silver strike. I took my wife. Calico silver gave us life. And somehow that struck Johnston so much, he, out of the darkness of this, I don't need to hear anymore. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. As far as I'm concerned, you're going to get a record deal. He said, but go on and finish the song. We finished it, and then Murphey played Texas Morning, and Johnston going, I can't believe it's the greatest stuff I've ever heard. You know? And so we did. We came to Nashville and recorded, and it was so tight. Everything was one take, 2 takes at the maximum, maybe on one song. But everything was, Johnston would go, that's great, let's move on. We went, wait a minute, I know we could do that. This is the first time nope, move on. So we cut 26 songs in that first 2 days, and they picked out Geronimo's Cadillac.
And before I ask Peter to put on his rock critic, music critic hat on here, I got to give a little plug for the Wittliff, because we have the Rubaiyat collection on display, part of it, and we have those papers here, which is the locale in Dallas where that chance meeting with Dylan's record producer took place. Now, Peter, let me ask you, records like Old Number One, records that Bob was involved with Jerry Jeff and Michael Martin Murphey, Cosmic Cowboy Souvenir, Ridin High, Viva Terlingua. I mean, those are rites of passage, right? If you're a fan of music, I mean, you've got to go. If you want to learn about Texas music, you've got to go through those records, don't you?
Well, I mean, I would say so. I mean, when I was co-editor of No Depression magazine, we were always looking for the young up-and-coming Americana acts, but we were also looking back all the time, and we wrote extensively and put these kinds of artists on our cover. We had Joe Ely on our cover, we had Guy Clark on our cover. So for me, it was always like you understand the music that's happening today a lot more if you go back and listen to those early records. And fortunately, just as a music fan when I was younger, I did that a lot. I was interested in hearing the new groups on the radio and stuff, but I liked to dig back into, I learned Bob Dylan from going back to those early records. And I remember the first time I checked out Red-Headed Stranger from the library when I was 10 years old, and I didn't get it. I was not ready for that yet, but I'm glad I did that back then, because it gave me an early idea of all of this stuff that would come later that would mean so much to me. And so yeah, those things are real touchstones. And part of it, like this book, Guy Clark's estate, the Guy Clark Foundation hired me to write this book about Old Number One, because it was the 50th anniversary of it coming out. And when those big anniversaries like that come about, it's a good opportunity to sort of re-examine those records. And Old Number One, I think, really stands up as a classic. I was just talking 2 nights ago to Verlin Thompson, who toured with Guy for the last 30 years of his life or so. And he was saying, he had recently picked up a copy of Old Number One and was looking at it, and he was like, that's our set list. What he was saying is, like, almost every song on that record, they played almost every night that he was with Guy. So that's how long-lasting a record like that was.
Before I ask Bob to read a little passage from his book, because Bob, I mean, what I've learned working here at the Wittliff Collections and getting to meet and know better some of these great musicians, but also as a journalist for more than 30 years, is the soul and the storytelling that they have. So, Ray Wiley Hubbard, if you've ever been in a room with him, can spin a great yarn, so could Jerry Jeff, but Bob really could. But right before that, I just want Peter to interject a little bit. There's a moment in the book when you talk about a phone call that Guy receives from Tom Waits. And, Bill Wittliff was so much about inspiration. I mean, there wasn't a day that went by that he wanted to connect the collections and the material to to them being a source of inspiration, whether, for a young person, for a student, for the public, as they access, original documents or audio. Do you know the phone call? Talk about that, because I think that, I don't know, I think it gave them a boost of confidence.
That's definitely one of my maybe my favorite anecdote in the book, and there's a little bit of a setup that involves the song "L.A. Freeway," which I recently moved. I was in Austin at the Statesman for about 10 years, and then I recently, about 2 years ago, moved to San Diego. And when I got the assignment to do this book, I was kind of fascinated to find that the song "L.A. Freeway" in some ways sort of started tangentially related to San Diego. Guy was living in Long Beach with Susanna. He drove down to San Diego to play a place called the Heritage Coffee House with a little trio he had with Skinny Dennis on bass. And the doorman at Heritage Coffee House around 1970 for about a year or so was Tom Waits. So they met, I think, that night, but they didn't really stay in touch or get to know each other. But I think Guy remembered Tom, and Tom remembered Guy. So the reason that L.A. Freeway was involved is because it was driving back from San Diego to Long Beach. He got caught in a crazy traffic jam in the middle of the night, and Guy was asleep in the back of the car. And he woke up and looked around, and he said, "If I can just get off of this L.A. freeway without getting killed or caught." Thought, hey, that's pretty good. And he grabbed Susanna's eyebrow pencil and wrote it on a paper sack in the back of the car and kept it, and the whole song resulted. So many years later, late 70s, maybe early 80s, Guy was hanging out in Nashville with a guitar player named Dick Feller, who is on Old Number One, and they somehow got to talking about Tom Waits, and Dick said, "Oh, he's a friend of mine. I think he's playing in Pittsburgh tonight or somewhere. I can't remember what the town was, but he said, I know where he's staying." And so Dick Feller proceeds to call the hotel, and he says, "Is Tom Waits staying there?" He said, "Yeah, he's in this room." So he gets him on the phone, and Dick says, "Hey, Tom, I really want you to meet this songwriter who's sitting here with me. He's a big fan of your music, and his name is Guy Clark." And he hands the phone over to Guy, and Tom Waits, just in that Tom Waits voice, "That old time feeling." He starts singing "That Old Time Feeling," and he sings the whole song, and he hangs up, and that's it. So, but Guy was just flabbergasted, and then it almost sounds like too good to be true, made up. But what I love about this is there's independent corroboration from the other side, because Steve Earle tells a story at one point where he was playing a show with Tom many years later in the 1990s, I think, in the Bay Area. And he was talking to Tom backstage, and Guy's name came up, and I think maybe Steve had heard this story, and he asked Guy about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, that absolutely happened." So we got confirmation from both sides of it. So I think that's a great story that was, some of these things get embellished, but I think that one was totally real.
Yeah. And I'm picturing Scott Newton's beautiful black and white photograph that shows Tom Waits in a smoky haze as you're telling that story there. That's amazing. Bob, I'll let you pick whatever passage you want to read from the book, because I think you could open any page. It's amazing. I did write about the book for the San Antonio Express-News, and then the Statesman picked it up, and then got to talk a little bit about it on NPR. I don't think I've ever read at least a memoir that begins with the scene that Bob chose to start the book with. But if you don't want to start there, just start wherever. I want to tease it out so y'all go buy the book, which we have for sale, both of them.
Yeah, it's the shortest.
Sure. Okay.
So we'll do He charged at me, snarling and spitting and cussing and slobbering. I'd already hit him a few times and had smashed him into my pickup door like a rag doll. We wrestled around to the side yard, asses and elbows, all dusty and bleeding, our bodies scraping on the limestone rocks, poking like dull knives out of the hard hill country ground. I hit him hard with an almost virgin fist, and he fell back for a few moments, then came after me again. He whacked me a good one on my left ear, the one that still rings. Some primal memory took over, and I actually got into a three-point stance, the one my high school football coach, Freddie Akers, drilled into me at Lubbock High. It was all instinct now, and I didn't have time to think. I whipped my glasses off and crouched. Here he comes. I sprang up hard, my fists together under my chin, elbows out, a perfect battering ram, up and out, smashing my forehead just under his chin. It's a wonder it didn't take his head off, though I tried. He fell back in a heap, and I was on him. He turned the tables and got the better of me for a while, but I ended up on top, in his face. Everything I grabbed was sweaty and slippery and greasy, and I couldn't get any traction. I tried to pull his hair out from the roots, but it just slipped through my fingers. No matter how hard I tried to do real damage and rip his ears off or gouge his eyeballs out, I couldn't get a hold of much of anything, and all of my efforts were for naught. Then, with my hands around his throat and looking into his eyes, I saw a staggering sight. He was grinning like a gargoyle and laughing through the spit and blood, his breath reeking of whiskey, cigarettes, and beer. And he was loving this. He wasn't taken seriously at all. I was beating the crap out of him, and he was laughing at me, laughing at us both. It was surreal and demonic in a funny sort of way. I'd only had one other fight in my life with Greg Cobb in the 5th grade, and here I was about to strangle Jerry Jeff Walker. And the day had started out so promising.
Yeah. Woo! Now, Bob, you've occasionally alluded to other parts of that story. Is there anything maybe that didn't make it onto the page that you could share a little bit with us?
Well, it does go on in the book to explain to a certain extent why this happened. But I was on that Texas Standard show the other day, and this David Brown said, "What made you open the book with that, such a bloody fight with Jerry Jeff? Why did you do that?" And then I'm thinking, yeah, why did I do it? Why did I do it? And what would make a grown man get to the point where he hits another grown man? And not only hits, but that fight really happened. And what is it? And the only answer is the only civilized answer at this point was a fist. And I can't explain exactly what went on to bring it, but there is a account. But believe me, it wouldn't have happened if he didn't deserve it, is all I got to say.
I got to ask one thing. You sort of slipped in there, your three-point stance and your high school football coach, Freddie Akers.
Freddie Akers.
Is that for real?
That's for real. When in 1966, I was going to Lubbock High School. I graduated in 67, but 66, I was playing football. And the new school in town, Coronado High, was just built, and at the end of that 66 year, we could go to Coronado, which is that's where I lived, over in that area of the world, and West Lubbock. But all of a sudden, the phone rings, and Bob, this is Freddie Akers, and I'm the new head football coach at Lubbock High, and I see you down as you're going to Coronado. What are you thinking? And I just said, well, my girlfriend lives over there, and all my friends are going over there. And he goes, no, man, you're going to be our starting defensive tackle. I said, I've never played it down so far. And he goes, you're the guy. You're the guy. You got to stay here. And he was so, positive and pretty much crazy. I mean, he made me excel in football because I would see his face in the opposing player's helmet. And I wanted to kill that guy, and that's he was intense.
Yeah, he when he ended up coach at UT in 1970s and 80s, I went to McCallum High School with his son Danny, who was also played for UT.
Yeah. Well, see, one day after practice in '66, and we had done real well in the season. We beat the crosstown rivals. Monterey for the Silver Spurs, and we were heroes, and it was on the front page of the paper all over the state. And we come in from a practice, and Darrell Royal's sitting there. And he goes, boys, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to take your coach. And he took him to be his offensive coordinator, and that started in '67.
That's great.
So, Peter, let me ask you, going from that temperament, and Bob's not the only one that has shared stories of how far Jerry Jeff could push somebody, drive somebody crazy sometimes. But Guy Clark is a different kind of animal. I mean, he played football too, but he's a different temperament, different sort of songwriter. I mean, I'll try to keep this to a tight question, but now half a century later, what is it about his songwriting style that it endures and makes him such a revered figure? And then what is it about his temperament that sort of set him apart from others of his era?
As a writer, I think more than anything, it was just these great small details that he used to illustrate things, and also he had a real connection to his own past and his childhood. I mean, one of the things that Steve Earle said about Desperados waiting for the train is like, he said, it's a very highly detailed song that Guy wrote about something that happened to him when he was like 8 years old, and Guy had these vivid memories of growing up in Texas, and you get what it feels like to be a kid in West Texas through his songs. And, he went to high school in Rockport and was building boats there, or learned to work on boats, and you get that in a lot of his songs. Later in his career, and that Boats to Build album specifically. So I think that was kind of it more than anything, and he was a great storyteller for sure. And the second part of your question was.
Well, I mean, kind of his temperament. I mean,
yeah,
and also I guess, I mean, there had to be. I mean, obviously, some ambition, but I mean, some of these songs have been around for a while, right? On this first album, I mean, the record cut in St. Five, they've been kind of around for him, right? They weren't like just brand new. And then he was maybe, if the word is right, ambivalent, perhaps, about performing at one point, or want to be more of a songwriter performer. I'm never quite clear where he fell.
I think he wanted to be. I think he got into it first for the songwriting, but I think he wanted to be a performer as well. He never wanted to be a star, but he wanted to have the career that I think he ended up having. I think he realized his own personal vision for that. He was not nearly as much of a raconteur as Jerry Jeff, but he's a complicated personality. He could be very outgoing and flamboyant and just a complete jokester at times, especially when he and Towns got together. They would get into all kinds of trouble together. But I would say generally, I think of him more as a quiet, reserved, and kind of serious guy. That's the way I think of Guy, and you can almost just tell by looking at him because he's got these heavy eyebrows and this scowl on his face, and he just looks like a guy who's taken what he does really seriously. And I think he did. I think he took songwriting very seriously. But it wasn't to the exclusion of being able to really cut up and get wild at times. So he was a complicated guy.
And I was going to say, go ahead, Bob.
Oh, I was just going to say that you were talking about how much the songs meant so much to him. And Jerry, the difference, I think, of Jerry Jeff and Guy, besides songwriting being the great, but his version of L.A. Freeway. You listen to Guy's, you don't get what it ended up with Jerry Jeff, which is this kick-ass rock and roll song that ends the night. And but we were up on stage at Billy Bob's, Texas, and we were doing Boats to Build. This thing is weird. We were doing Boats to Build, and I was playing bass. I was on stage right, had a microphone. I'm singing the chorus, and here comes a guy, and he's next to me, and so he's singing on my mic, and it gets to the chorus, and I can't even remember the word now, but it's the difference between if and but. One word that takes it completely to a different place, and Guy, while we're on stage, he goes, "That son of a bitch, he changed my, why does he do things like that?" So, one word is enough for him.
Well, where I was going to go was Bob Livingston knows a lot about temperament because, as one of the original co-founders of the Lost Gonzo Band, what became known as the Lost Gonzo Band. Those musicians are what really brought to life and kicked it in the ass for Jerry Jeff himself. He was, you see all the pictures, Burton Wilson photographs, Jerry Jeff's content on a stool, but it took you guys to kind of kick it up. I think the same for Michael Martin Murphey. But talk a little bit about, we're talking about Jerry Jeff's personality, Guy Clark's. Where does Michael fit into that? Because he's pretty meticulous in his songwriting. And can you do maybe is there any maybe comparison, or are they similar, not dissimilar?
Well, I had been a fan of Murphy's before I ever met him. I went to Red River, New Mexico in like 1969, that summer. And there was a group, I got a gig, it was my first gig out of the nest, and I had heard about this band down the street, a folk trio, in their own club, the Outpost, and they were called Three Faces West. Talk about Texas Music History 101, Three Faces West. And those guys were just, Ray Hubbard's in the group, right? And he wasn't Wiley yet. He was just plain old Ray Hubbard. And Rick Fowler, Wayne Kidd. And they played stuff that I'd never heard before in my life, including songs like Texas Morning, Michael Murphey, and Wildfire. He'd already written Wildfire, had never recorded it. And I was thinking, this stuff is this is great. And when I went to L.A., that's why it was so exciting to meet him. And he had been a bass player in a country band called Tex. And he knew rock and roll, and he could scream like Little Richard, and got him into a lot of trouble. When we made that record, there's a song, Geronimo's Cadillac, a song called Harbor for My Soul on it. Do you believe it? Yes, I do. And we would get into it. We're rocking. He's got a band that'll go anywhere he wants to go. Same way with Jerry Jeff. We would go anywhere those guys wanted to go. And Murphy is screaming so that by the time the second album comes along, Cosmic Cowboy, he has no voice. He has nodules on his vocal cords. The doctor says, you can't speak for 7 weeks, much less sing. And you can never play in a club again where they're smoking. And I think that Murphy was one of the originators of no smoking bands, because I'd never played in a place like that. But Murphey, he could scream, he could sing, and with the right band around him. Now he's pretty much country, old cowboy songs, but at the time. And then Jerry Jeff was a folkie. And when we went to New York, after that first album, we did a tour to promote that record. It was me, Gary Nunn, Michael McGarry, and Craig Hillis. And we played, and all of his friends, the folkies, came out, and people like Harry Belafonte and Christofferson and Rita Coolidge and
Phoebe Snow was there,
Phoebe Snow came out 3 or 4 times, and they just liked this Texas rawness that they had never seen Jerry Jeff have before, and a lot of people liked it. So it's kind of and you know it could Guy was the great songwriter, but he couldn't fill up Carnegie Hall, or he couldn't. These places that we played where they're hanging from the rafters. I never played a gig with Jerry Jeff where they wasn't packed to the walls. So, and Jerry Jeff had that magnetism, always did as a songwriter. He could do it, but he could deliver the goods as a solo performer. He sounded friggin' great.
Before I ask Peter the question I was thinking about, let me just ask you one other thing. Like when Jerry Jeff, you know, even though you had met Guy Clark before, but like when he would present a Guy Clark song, I mean, did you automatically like it? What did it take? Did you wonder about? I mean, was there any hesitation on anyone's part, or did it make total sense?
Yeah, total sense. I mean, when we did L.A. Freeway, we recorded most of the album in Austin, but we go to New York, and Jerry just said, "I got to finish that record. And I got some people that I met in a band up here, and we went up there. But me and Gary, it was Electric Ladyland Studios in New York, and we walk in, and that's the song we do is L.A. Freeway. And Andy Newmark, you know who he was? He's a drummer, Cat Stevens, Plastic Ono Band. He played on about 1,000 #1 records, and he was the drummer that night. And we learned L.A. Freeway. And did it. I think we might have played it every once in a while, but we sure didn't have it in the set yet. And it just became this massive rocker.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I think the greatest version of it was the one that was never released from Viva Terlingua. In the digitization efforts that we had, we discovered unreleased performances from the August 18th, 73 gig, but also other alternative versions and slightly different arrangements. And that night on August 18th, I think that's the most rock and roaring version of that song I ever heard.
There's something you mentioned about Guy being so annoyed by one word being changed, and it's interesting because the versions of L.A. Freeway are certainly very different in tempo and feel. The words are pretty close, but Jerry Jeff changed a couple of things. And one of them, Guy sings Love's a Gift That's Surely Handmade. And Jerry Jeff sang Love's a Gift That's Truly Handmade. And 50 years later, the Guy Clark Foundation, this was just a year or two ago, they decided to start up a record label, and they decided to call it Truly Handmade Records. So they used Jerry Jeff's change.
It went both ways.
As a rock and roll geek, I love, books that dissect records or, box sets, because you get into sort of the weeds on this stuff. In Peter's book, going back to this idea that there was a different conception of old #1, or at least an original stab at it, that was later shelved. I want to go back a little bit in that story, because how did Guy Clark put himself in that situation? Because Guy Clark met with the producer, right, who outlined that, he was impressed with his music, loved the songs, but that he was going to give him, and he was going to record in Nashville. So I think even then, I'm old enough to remember Nashville had that reputation of the way that they do things, but he was going to give him the Memphis sound. So why, in your research or interviews that you've gone through, why would Guy put himself in that situation when he is an obvious, he's hard to categorize, but he is essentially a folk singer. Why would he
Yeah,
agree to that?
I think it was a mistake, and Guy realized it was a mistake. But he was in a difficult situation because this guy offers him a record deal on RCA Records, and he says, "But I've got to produce it." And if he says no, then does the guy still do it, or does the guy say, "Fine, go find another record label"? And I think he wanted to kind of play ball, but once he really got into it, he realized he just couldn't. He was too much, wanted to be in control of his own artistic identity. So I think Guy would acknowledge that he made a mistake, and he was just in a situation where that was kind of what he needed to do at a time to get the record deal.
But did he make a mistake recording in Nashville?
I don't think so. I don't think he had a problem with Nashville. There's this whole idea of the Memphis sound, and it's sort of a more soulful and horns and things that are not necessarily bad, but they are not necessarily the right arrangements for Guy's songs. The thing that I found most interesting about this, I went and read a book that a woman named Erin Osman wrote about John Prine's 1971 debut album, and it was it's also a classic record. It's got Angel from Montgomery, it's got Sam Stone, it's got Hello in there, it's got a lot of Prine's most famous songs, and they were in a pretty similar situation, Prine in 71 and Guy in 75, in that both times it was using this sort of Memphis musicians from Chips Moman's American Sound recording studios, and then he also had a studio in Nashville called American Studios, and so they were both songwriters who were being paired with this Memphis Sound band kind of thing. Prine decided to just kind of go along with it. Guy's idea was this doesn't sound like me, I'm going to do it over. Prine just kind of played ball with it and let it go, and the record ended up becoming a hugely important record in American music. So could Guy have gone along and still had a good record? I think probably so. I don't think it was the disaster that he made it out to be. But I also respect him for standing up for his own vision on it.
Can I ask a question? You say Memphis sound. Why do you say Memphis sound is recorded in Nashville?
Yeah, it was because of certain musicians that they brought over from Memphis, I think.
And the horns.
And the horns. Some of those were actually from Muscle Shoals. So the whole idea of this Memphis sound, it's always been a little bit of a misnomer to me because it doesn't necessarily mean recorded there.
Does
but
he have
it was
horns
more of a soulful thing. And there were horns on the record that he made with Guy, and I don't think Guy liked that really. I don't think they were that bad. There was a version of Don't Let the Sunshine Fool You, which was going to be the first song on Old Number One, and it had this whole horn section element to it, and I think it just rubbed Guy the wrong way.
Yeah, and I think too, like reading the book, Peter's book, and Bob's too, you understand it's not only the temperament, but it's the musical approach. Like in your book, talking about it's not only that he didn't like it, but his style of playing the guitar also didn't fit in what a Memphis sound would be, because it's based on a groove, and Guy's approach, like a lot of singer-songwriters, is a little bit more, maybe goes with the words, maybe the tempo, a lot of it is performance, right, in bringing out certain syllables or words, and sometimes when, if you're doing an R&B thing, it's very much has to be in that groove. Jerry Jeff could be pretty raw on that guitar, but I had the privilege, and it is a privilege, to listen to the multi-track tapes of Viva Terlingua and that first album and other stuff that we have at the Wittliff. And when you take, you can listen to the different instruments, but when you take Jerry Jeff out of the mix, it doesn't sound right. That's the difference. Jerry Jeff adds the grit and that kind of punch that makes the songs a little bit not pretty, and I think Guys needed that sort of idiosyncratic delivery that worked, that eventually that he hit on. I would compare it a little bit to Townes Van Zandt. We've been lucky. We have the earliest known recording of Townes. He was 20 years old. It was recorded in February of '65. by another great folk singer, Baxter Taylor, who was a great musician, but sometimes some of their greatest contribution might just be documenting the moment. And hearing towns just unadorned, playing, with it not being self-conscious and just picking the guitar. I mean, it's some of his best work, and it's only been recently seen the light of day a little bit, on Sirius XM and here and there. Bob, do you want to read something else? Do you want to illustrate something by song, or what you in any kind of mood that you want to do?
I mean, I could, I did all these. I could explain it, but I could read it. What do you think? Somebody put this thing back in there.
There you go.
There we go.
I'd love to hear you play.
Okay.
At least a little bit, right, folks? Do we want to hear him play a little bit? It is a new year, a new era. And Bob Livingston, let me tell you, as Bob's getting set up, one of the greatest moments I'll never forget, and we had debated, I remember in the meetings, remember, Abby, should we do it? We had the Viva Terlingua, the surviving members of the musicians that had made that record of the Gonzo Band. And so the whole idea was to talk about the records, and we were playing snippets of the discoveries that we had made. But then we were thinking, and we had Bob Livingston's piano, the piano that was used in Luckenbach, that was used on the records, taken on the road, this big, clunky spinet piano. And Bob, like a Pied Piper, let us all in. There was hundreds of people. We've never had as many people in that music gallery singing around the piano with Gary P. Nunn and Bob. So take it away, my friend. I don't want to.
Well, this is in the book, but I can tell it as a story. We were playing with Jerry Jeff. We were playing with Michael Murphey. We were the band for both of them. We were going back and forth. The Austin Interchangeable Band, somebody called it. And at some point, we'd make this Cosmic Cowboy record with Murphy, and there's some disagreements, some things happen, and we quit Murphy. And we all come back to Texas from Nashville after recording this, literally after recording Cosmic Cowboy. On the last note, we were out the door driving home. Everybody went back, everybody but Gary P. Nunn. Now, why didn't he go back? Because he had a song on the record that he had written with Murphy called Song of the South Canadian River. Drink life one drop at a time. It's just this beautiful song and all these movements, and Gary played the piano, and it was just a tremendous, and he thought that maybe Murphy would be so whatever to take this song off the record if he left too. So he stuck it out, and for his loyalty, Murphy took him to London to mix that album at Abbey Road Studios, and it's 20 in the it's the worst winter in 20 years, and Gary didn't have enough warm clothes, and staying in a flat, and he wrote London Homesick Blues, and they come back. He comes back. He's going to quit the music business. He was going to become a pharmacist. Gary Nunn had a pharmacy degree. He was going for it, and he was leaving the music business. And but we lassoed Gary, took him to Luckenbach, and he sang that song under the trees one day. And Jerry Jeff said, "Let's do it." So we put it on the record. But meanwhile, as we're rehearsing, we're there in Luckenbach, and we had discovered this world-class mobile recording studio in New York City in the guise of a bus that was just parked there on the street with wires going into it and out of it, into a door ajar. And when we look in the door, there was a Broadway play going on. They were recording the whole thing. So Jerry knocked on the door of the bus. "What is this?" And he said, "Oh, this is a mobile recording studio. There's only 2 of them in the world." That's what the guy said. And he said, "You can go anywhere?" And he goes, "Yeah, we can go anywhere." He said, "Will you go to Luckenbach?" And the guy went, yeah, we'll go to Lukenbach. Where is that, son? And it was Dale Ashby and father. They'd never heard of it. And they brought that bus. And so it arrived. We're all there just going over songs, sitting on these hay bales. They set up bales of hay for baffles. And we're just kind of and Jerry Jeff had this big galvanized tub full of wine, and he's cutting up, he's making sangria wine, and it was his recipe, and he's cutting up apples and oranges and throwing them in there and probably pouring some Everclear. And, it was, so we'd sip a little sangria and pick a song, sip a little sangria and pick a song. And at some point, they plugged this whole thing in. Okay, let's hear what it sounds like. And it blew out 6 counties of electricity. They had to rewire the whole place. And when they finally got it going, that's when Jerry Jeff picks up his guitar and he goes, "Hi, buckaroos. Scamp walker time again. Think it time to slide one by you once more. No matter how you do it, you just do it like you know what you're doing. Been down the road once or twice before, and getting by is my stock in trade. Living it day to day, picking up the pieces wherever they fall. Just letting it roll, letting the high times carry the low. Living my life easy come, easy go. Well, today I was thinking, it's a Wittliff time again, and I can hear Hector pacing the floor. Hey, Hector, don't you worry, something bound to come out. Been down the road once or twice before, sing it if you know it. And getting by is my stock in trade. Living it day to day, living it day to day. Picking up the pieces wherever they fall. Just letting it roll, letting the high times carry the low. Living my life, easy come, easy go. What'd you say? Living my life, easy come. Here we go, the Wittliff Center.
Yeah, Bob Livingston. Woo!
That song it just has a great philosophy, and I think that's what Jerry Jeff lived by. And living my life, easy come, easy go. Yeah, it was pretty much Jerry Jeff.
I want to ask Peter here, because he's got, not only is it a compilation of a lot of great interviews conducted over the years by different colleagues of yours and people and himself, original research, and dissection of music, but also, you get a perspective on Guy Clark from his peers that maybe is food for thought. So, for one, I want to kind of combine 2 different voices. Emmylou Harris kind of told you that he was really inventing a new kind of music, because he really wasn't country. He's not, where does he kind of fit in? I think talk to that point. And then also Rodney Crowell in the book described Guy as a song actor. So what do you think that they're getting at with regard to Guy and his songs as far as the kind of music that he was creating, the song structures or the style? And then this idea again of Guy being a quote, song actor.
Yeah, I think Emmylou was referring to, and I think Rodney said this in the book at some point as well. These were both interviews that were not ones that I conducted, but either done by Tamara Saviano when she was writing her Guy Clark biography. She shared dozens of interviews that she had done with me to help with researching this book. And then there's a writer in Dallas named Natalie Weiner who did some interviews mainly with people who had been on the old #1 record. There were about 25 people who played or sang on it, and about half of them are still alive, and she talked to, I think, everybody. And I think it might have been her that talked to Emmylou that was talking about him him creating this new kind of music. And really, I think she was just getting at that these were the sort of seeds of what we call Americana now. And she was certainly right at the center of that because when she sang with Graham Parsons, that was even a few years before Old Number One came out. So Guy didn't necessarily, I wouldn't say he created that, but he was certainly part of the early genesis of all of that has developed into what we think of as Americana these days.
Yeah, and author and music journalist Jeffrey Himes, a friend of yours, has a book called In-Law Country. That's how he kind of described that whole scene. I want to open up the whole event to questions. I can bring the mic around because they're the stars of the show. Anybody perhaps... I'm going to start in the back just because he raised his hand first. I'm going to pull my little Phil Donahue thing here. Hang on a sec. I'm bringing the mic around right here.
This is for Peter. Guy Clark, I've often read that he made his own guitars, that he had a workshop and he built his own guitars. And I've worked some shows and stuff with him. He was pretty, he didn't really share a whole lot of information with, just anybody. And he didn't really go into a lot of detail about his guitars, except for he would say that anything you could buy pretty much sucks, so he started making his own. And what I was curious is, did you ever run across anybody that ever played those guitars besides himself? And if so, were they any good?
I think there's some of that in Tamara's book, and I think there may have also been a little bit more in the interviews she sent me that did not make it in her book. I think he made like a dozen or so guitars over the course of his life, and there was one, I wish I could remember who, but there was one in particular where somebody who said that, yeah, Guy gave him one of the guitars. But I can't imagine they weren't great sounding guitars because Guy spent a lot of time on them. Yeah, but exactly, the thing that fascinated me is how he learned some of that stuff was when he was in Southern California. He ended up working at a dobro shop there, and that was kind of how he got into becoming a luthier. But yeah, there's not as much. That's something that it didn't really come up in my book because I was writing specifically about this record. But that's something I would like to know more and may research at some point myself. Where are these guitars? Who has them? Yeah. Is somebody still out there playing them? I think Verlin Thompson has one of them, who was his longtime touring partner.
A few of those guitars are at the Country Music Hall of Fame right now, sort of in a little bit of a limbo because of a legal settlement, but they, a few of the existing guitars that he still had.
And I was just at the Country Music Hall of Fame 2 days ago, and they have a really great exhibit of just this room that is basically a recreation of Guy's basement workshop where he built the guitars, where he wrote a lot of his songs. And there's like cassette tapes of demos that he had recorded over the years, or just home demos on the wall. And it's a great. It's probably my favorite thing in the Country Music Hall of Fame right now.
Is that the exact? I mean, that is his workshop. They actually took it, put it there.
What happened? Tamara Saviano told me this. They had at some point after Guy died in 2016, they had packed it all up, but Tamara's husband, Paul Whitfield, who co-directed the movie, the documentary film with her, had taken a ton of photos of the space before it was deconstructed. And so based on all of those photos, they were able to reconstruct everything. So it didn't go straight from the basement to the Hall of Fame. It went from the basement into boxes and then recreated for the Hall of Fame.
Stuff, and those cassettes are actual demos.
Yes, those are. Yeah, yes,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like the recreation of the 1962 apartment that Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, and Keith Richards shared that I got to see on tour, and it was that one was a mess. But anyway, we have another question here, and one other note with regard to Guy Clark guitar. Even on one of the discoveries we made on the digitization was sort of the mission statement of that whole Viva Terlingua album when Jerry Jeff is kind of cajoling you guys and talking, said, oh, yeah, we're going to make a record with my friends, and Guy Clark even fixed this guitar. So here, let me turn it over.
Oh, do I need to speak? Hi, Bob. Somebody had this great quote. I thought it was John T., but he said he didn't say it. Somebody said the Gonzos all have PTSD from being on the road with Jerry Jeff, but that he didn't have a playlist per se. During the recording, he would just start a song. Do you remember that? Was it just like 1, 2, 3, go, and y'all had to figure out what it was, or were y'all just
there was never any 1, 2, 3, go.
Yeah, it was just go.
I mean,
Yeah,
but it was basically right off at the get-go. We're playing. He's playing the guitar, and he's doing this song, and we're learning it, and all of a sudden we got the groove going, and we've got a chorus, and then invariably the engineer would stop the track and say, okay, I think we got sounds. Sounding real good. And Jerry Jeff's like, what are you talking about? We're in the middle of the take. You know, and when I sit down here, you punch that red, make it red, you know, go into recording, because you never know what's going to come. And that's true. And that's why Jerry Jeff, I mean, he hated count-offs, he hated click tracks. We never played with any of that stuff that they have to have now. And so, yeah, it was intensely great. I don't know if I answered your question.
Did you know what songs you were going to be on Viva Terlingua when you went on stage?
Did we know what songs were going to be on that record? Yeah. He had, you know, he was doing it right there. All his records were like, you know, I'm writing it, and I'm sitting here writing it right now. Like Sangria Wine all had different, every time we did it, it was a different chorus. And, different verse. And he kind of knew, but like that whole verse he did about, today I was thinking, it's record time again. I can hear Mike Maitland pacing the floor. Mike Maitland was the president of MCA Records. And so he was sending this shout out. I can hear him, Mike, don't you worry, something's bound to come out. Because Maitland liked him, you know, and I mean, MCA had The Who and Elton John, and I don't think Maitland liked any of those guys, but, you know, Jerry Jeff was a good old, you know, whiskey drinking wherever he lived up there, Oneonta, New York. I think Maitland was from there too, and they drank whiskey together many times, and so he was giving him a shout out.
Yeah. Speaking of shout-outs, Gary P. Nunn and Ray Wiley Hubbard should probably pay you royalties for. We only know them by those names because of Bob's voice on that record introducing them that way.
That's right.
Here, we got a question right here, folks.
Gary P. Nunn. It's a reminiscence, and I'm sorry to do this, a personal story, but it just illustrates. I was given an expense-paid trip to Okinawa in 1971 by the U.S. government. And so I was kind of a rock and roll guy and a fledgling broadcaster, and I'm having a fine time. It wasn't Vietnam. And so the PX started having these records, and I guess maybe old number one might have been one of the early ones. And everybody was getting signed to the labels, and so they started having all the Michael Murphey and the Jerry Jeff Walker and the Ray Wiley Hubbard and the all those guys, Billy Joe, you know. I learned about where Terlingua was and Fredericksburg or Lukenbach. And when I came back out of the Army, I wound up moving to Texas because of that music. It converted me. And the first show I went to was at Palmer Auditorium. And it was this guy and Jerry Jeff and Gary P., and this whole new world came alive to me, just watching you guys switching off instruments, you know, and God bless. Now you're my friends. It's cool.
God bless you, Roger.
It was a truly monumental convergence for me, you know, to discover it, and it was fun. Bob Dylan and Doug Somm.
That's why all these books are so great. We do have them for sale. We've got more questions, but here's Richard Scans.
Yeah, just real quick. I know, Bob, I think 25 years ago, I interviewed you for one of the first times I was doing a big story on Jerry Jeff, and you told me this image that kind of stuck with me, talking about you were playing with Michael and his band, and then Jerry Jeffs kind of took the band and used his, but you described Michael, I know you just, earlier you said, described Michael like how he could really be a rock and roller in his shows too, but at the time you described him as like, at the time how he was kind of like this golden messiah and white, on the scene, and then going to Jerry Jeff, and I always had this image of like, the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other.
Yes.
Just wondering like how accurate that was, like going from playing with one guy to the other. Was it like, oh, it's a whole different set of rules, or was it too simplified?
It was a different set of rules in a way, but both of those guys were willing to, everything was 1 or 2 takes. We would know it, and in Jerry Jeff's case, we wouldn't know it. And if we did it and it fell apart, he'd say, I love it, keep it. So, but Murphy, we just knew the stuff, and after 1 or 2 takes, whoever was in charge would say, we got it. So, yeah, it was a lot of, and you're right about the devil and the angel. Murphy would wear the white Muslim pants and shirt and long blonde hair and his red beard and at the armadillo, he was the Messiah.
I know Guy and Jerry Jeff, I'm sure, spent a lot of time with Towns. I was wondering if you ever met Towns Van Zandt, and if so, what was that experience like for you?
Oh, yeah. Well, we played a lot of shows with him, and Towns was a hard-drinking guy, and Jerry Jeff was very susceptible, so when he would play, it usually turned into a, late night, 2 or 3 nights in a row, and we're on the road, and we have to get Jerry Jeff up, and we got to get Towns awake. And it's like, come on, let's go. It was that was all built in. But Towns, even when he was 3 sheets to the wind or wherever he got, it was all fascinating, mesmerizing. But yeah.
The last time I saw Towns was 1995 in Seattle, where I was living at the time. It was right around the time that we started No Depression magazine. And I had written a piece about Towns for the local paper previewing the show. And I went down to the club early for sound check just to say hello. And I knew the club owner, so he let me in. And Towns, it turned out, had after sound check, but before the show, he had a radio interview at a station downtown. And the club owner said, well, why don't you give Towns a ride down to the radio interview? And I was like, yeah, sure, that'd be great. So we got out to my car, and it was at this really weird 5-way intersection where we needed to sort of almost do a U-turn but go down the diagonal street as opposed to a complete U-turn. And I was parked right at the light, and it was just, can I get straight over there? And I just decided to pull out and go and realized in the middle of it that I had run probably at least 2 red lights. And I was sort of sheepishly saying, Towns said something like, oh, that was a smooth move. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry about that. I didn't, I think that was probably illegal. And Towns says, oh, it was totally illegal, but it was a smooth move.
This is for Bob. Several years ago, I knew you had a big passion for establishing the Austin Music Museum, and I wondered whatever became of that project.
Austin Music Museum. Everybody wonders whatever happened to that. Yeah, there is no Austin Music. Here's the thing. There's over on 11th Street, I don't know if it's still there, but the guy, his name is Clay Shorkey. He's a professor at University of Texas, and he's the one that had the Austin Music Museum. And he could never get any funding. He couldn't get anybody to do things. I was on the music commission at the time, and we would have these meetings with all the disparate museums all over the state, the North Texas history, the songwriters history, and all these people would come, and everybody was so jealous of their archives and of the way they wanted it, and they didn't want it to be in Austin. They said, it's us, everything is Austin. You know, we want it to be in Rosebud. Well, where's that? You know, and so it never has happened, and they've never been able to. At some point, right across from the Bob Bullock Museum, they contacted and said, that's where we're going to do the Austin Music Museum. But they couldn't. There were all those same forces got together to rally against it, so they built a parking lot instead. So.
And speaking of another great book, Diana's book about Delbert McClinton. And I want to remind everybody, Bob and Peter's book is for sale. They'll sign it for you, but here's another question.
I have this question for you, Bob. You know, we've got this magic world that's Austin, and you're all just wandering up and down the streets. Tell us the story about how you were with Michael, and then Jerry Jeff came along, and you ran away with the circus.
I had met, I knew Michael out in Los Angeles, and we were living up in Wrightwood, California, and Murphy said, hey, let's go hear Jerry Jeff Walker at the Troubadour tonight. And, you know, I'd, of course, heard Jerry Jeff and Mr. Bojangles and thought it was great. And, he's playing at the Troubadour, and they're in Santa Monica. So we go to the show, and he was opening for Linda Ronstadt, and the band was the Eagles. Glenn Frey, the drummer, Don Henley. And so, you know, Jerry Jeff, we're sitting right there in the about third, fourth row, and Jerry Jeff walks out, and he sits down, and he crosses his legs kind of like this, and this pants leg comes up, and there are these boots, and it look like hieroglyphics on it or something, these funky boots. I'd never seen anything like it, really cool. And he put out his guitar, and he plays, and he's just him and the guitar. And after the show, after he played, we all went, you know, backstage into the bar, and we said, well, what are you going to do after the show? And he goes, oh man, we'll go to your house. And so I was living in Beverly Glen Boulevard, and Murphy and we go out, and we listen to about half of Linda Ronstadt, and we said, we better get prepared. So we take off, and we get, you know, food and beer and stuff and chips and dips, and we have it all lined up, and they never show up. And Murphy, of course, takes advantage of your chances. He wrote this song called Empty-Handed Compadres. We thought we'd be bringing back something good for the shack. Looks like we're out of whack again. Yeah, we're just empty-handed. So that was my first meeting sort of with Jerry Jeff. But then when I was living in Red River, I went to Red River maybe that summer, and Jerry Jeff showed up in Red River and took a cabin up Bitter Creek Road and started writing songs. And he wrote Old Beat Up Guitar. He wrote Charlie Dunn, High Hill Country Rain, a lot of the songs that ended up on their first record. And he started writing that, and I'm sort of friends with him. And then the Murphy thing happens, and we do Geronimo's Cadillac, and we're hanging out at the Les Amis Cafe. They're on Nueces and 24th Street. And it was me and Gary Nunn and Murphy and a couple other guys, and the door opened, and first thing I noticed about him was those boots, those same boots, and it was Jerry Jeff. And he walked up to our table and said, man, you look like a bunch of itinerant footloose musicians such as myself. Do you mind if I sit down? And he sat down and said, I've got these songs I wrote up in Red River, and would you play on it? And we had cut that Geronimo's Cadillac. We had the band. It was instant band. So we just kind of looked into Jerry Jeff, the vibe and the thing, and he liked what we brought to it and the spontaneity, and he was just such a, that's what he wanted. He just wanted to be loose and haphazard and rocking. And so that's how we got in with Jerry, Jeff, and Murphy at the same time. We'd go back and forth and we'd play, and one thing led to another, and we were able to put those 4 albums, which were Murphy's Geronimo's Cadillac, and then the Jerry Jeff Brown album with L.A. Freeway, and then we cut Cosmic Cowboy Souvenir, and then went to Lukenbach and did Viva Terlingua. And it was those 4 records that and then we ended up just being with Jerry Jeff for the next 17 records or something.
Anyone else?
I just followed up on those boots that he had. In the Charlie Dunn song, did Charlie Dunn make those boots?
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh yeah. Charlie Dunn made those boots, and everybody had to have Charlie Dunn boots. And I remember I got some Charlie Dunn boots made, and they just, I hated them. They didn't feel good. There was an arch in it that was sticking out, and I kept thinking, I got to get them fixed up. They were really cool looking, but they were just maddening. And they're in my closet, and coat hangers kind of got down and covered them up, and my wife took them to Goodwill.
Oh, no. All right. Well,
I said, how could you do that? She said, well, you never wear them. All you did is complain. And I had to say, you're right.
Okay, we got 2 more questions. Here's the first of those 2.
Hi, Bob. We had the opportunity to meet at the Graham Parsons tribute show this year when I was randomly at like 7 p.m. in the day. But I had a question about the first Lost Gonzo Band album. I found the album just sitting in a record stack somewhere, and I've done some research. Has there ever been an effort to do like a repressing of any of those albums around that time?
Say it again.
Has there ever been an effort to do repressings of the first Lost Gonzo Band album?
Not that I know of. No. You need to write MCA and tell them I don't even think MCA owns them anymore.
I'm sending a letter today.
Who knows if we could get a hold of them?
I mean, the beauty of a place like the Wittliff Collections is that a lot of those tapes, unfortunately, a few years ago went up in flames. A lot of the original master recordings of a lot of artists. There was a question over here. Right.
Thanks, Hector. I've got a question for not only the 2 gentlemen on stage, but Hector as well. The music we're talking about, I look around the room and all the silver-haired folks, this is the music of our lives. I mean, this was the zeitgeist that, we brought up on, and me and my sidekick, of course, playing music all the way up on the stereo. Is there hope for American youth? I mean, do we have this kind of music still being played, or do I need to replay the Brown album for the rest of my life?
I think there's definitely hope, and there's some really good. I don't know if you know this Dallas Burrow, but he is he's out there plugging it. Has the Redbird Cafe, and he's a good one. But I don't know if any of y'all know.
Well, when we started No Depression magazine in 1995, it was precisely to underscore that yes, there are young artists coming along in the wake of these legends from the 70s who were so integral in getting it all started. And now it's 30 years past that, and there's a whole other generation past those bands. So when I look at someone like Margot Price, I would say is a great example of someone in her 30s who is completely pulling from that history and doing her own thing with her own spirit. She's interviewed in the Guy Clark book because she has this great story about first hearing Old Number One on the jukebox at Devil's Backbone Tavern. And she's one of 10 artists who are on a record that's coming out in April that I just heard for the first time a couple of days ago that is a recreation of Old Number One. It's going to be called Old Number One Revisited, and it's coming out on Truly Handmade Records, and it's 10 contemporary artists doing those same songs in sequence, and it's really, really good, and almost all of them are younger artists. So yeah, there is definitely the other generations have been picking up that torch and carrying it for 50 years now, I would say. So it's some of it's a little harder to find. Some of it's really big. Margot is very successful. I think you could say Jason Isbell is in this same camp of people drawing from those artists. So it's out there, yeah. And Todd Snyder, although he's gone now, is a great example of someone who carried that on in someone like Jerry Jeff's footsteps. So,
I mean, Charlie Crockett, he came and visited the galleries. I mean, he's excellent and says he draws from that spirit of that music. Even Sarah Jaros, who doesn't exactly sound like that, but she's she grew up in the area, is influenced by that. She's a wonderful songwriter and multi-instrumentalist. There's a young woman out of Corpus Christi named Marcy Grace, who is, just a real barnstormer. So there still are young people, I think, that they're drawn to the mystique, but also the sound, because it was not a pure country sound. I mean, they were people like Guy Clark and even Jerry Jeff and what you guys were doing with Lukenbach. I mean, they're fighting the great forces that are happening in pop music. I mean, at that same time as Viva Terlingua, you've got the Eagles, and Linda Ronstadt. I mean, those are monster sort of Hot 100 hits. But to me, Guy Clark and people like Jerry Jeff Walker and Bob Livingston or Townes Van Zandt are like foundation blocks. They're elemental. They're the inspiration of what sometimes bubbles up into the Hot 100. Anyway, I have to say a big thank you to Peter Blackstock and Bob Livingston.
Thank you.
We have their books for sale, and
let's hear it for Hector Saldana, too, that put it together. And the Wittliff Collection. Thank you.
Yeah.